April 1861. The cannons at Fort Sumter had barely finished echoing across Charleston Harbor when this photograph was taken at Magnolia Grove Plantation. The nation was tearing itself apart, but inside the grand manor house, time seemed suspended in amber, thick, golden, and deadly still. What you're about to hear is based on a daguerreotype discovered in the Charleston Historical Society archives. A wedding portrait that at first glance appears to capture the last gasp of antebellum elegance, but when modern digital enhancement revealed what the ornate mirror in the background was truly reflecting. Well, some truths are better left buried in the ashes of the Old South. If you enjoy spine-chilling stories that blur the line between history and horror, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Let me tell you about the last wedding at Magnolia Grove and the photograph that captured more than just the living. The daguerreotype camera stood like a mechanical sentinel in the grand parlor of Magnolia Grove Plantation, its brass fittings gleaming in the filtered April sunlight. Outside, the Spanish moss whispered secrets of war and change, but inside the manor, tradition reigned supreme. Eleanor Beaumont, soon to be Mrs. Frederick Ashworth, stood resplendent in her grandmother's wedding gown, the French silk and Brussels lace, a testament to the family's wealth and status. The dress had been worn by 3 generations of Beaumont brides, each adding their own touches. Seed pearls from Paris, ribbon from London, lace from convents in Belgium. It was more than a garment, it was a symbol of Southern aristocracy itself. Beside her, Frederick cut an imposing figure in his Confederate officer's uniform. The grey wool was new, the brass buttons polished to perfection, the sword at his side a family heirloom that had seen service in the Revolution. He was to report to his regiment in Virginia within the week, but today belonged to love and tradition. Behind them, barely visible in the formal composition, stood Evelyn. No last name, slaves at Magnolia Grove were known only by their given names, their identities bound to the plantation itself. She had been Eleanor's personal maid since childhood, a girl of perhaps 20, with intelligent eyes and hands that could work miracles with hair and fabric. The photographer, a nervous man named Josiah Crane, who had traveled down from Richmond, adjusted his equipment with trembling fingers. The war had made everyone nervous, but there was something else about Magnolia Grove that unsettled him. Perhaps it was the way the shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, or how certain rooms felt colder than they should in the Carolina spring. "Remain perfectly still," Josiah instructed, though his voice quavered slightly. "The exposure will require nearly a full minute." Oh, what Josiah didn't notice, what none of them noticed in that moment, was the massive mirror positioned behind the wedding party. A French antique that had graced the parlor since before the Revolution. Its silver backing had witnessed generations of Beaumont celebrations, tragedies, and secrets. The mirror had reflected the faces of patriots and loyalists, masters and slaves, the living and the dead. As the camera began its long exposure, the mirror began to tell its own story. Eleanor felt a chill despite the warm April air. The wedding dress, magnificent as it was, felt heavy, not just with fabric and history, but with something else she couldn't name. She had wanted to postpone the wedding until after the war, but Frederick's mother, the formidable Mrs. Ashworth, had insisted on proceeding. "Uncertain times call for certain traditions," she had declared, with the authority of someone who had never been contradicted. "The Ashworth men have always married before going to war. It brings them luck." Frederick squeezed Eleanor's gloved hand gently, mistaking her shiver for pre-wedding nerves. He was a good man, she reminded herself. Educated at West Point, with progressive ideas about the treatment of slaves that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He had even insisted that Evelyn be included in their wedding portrait, a gesture that had scandalized his mother but pleased Eleanor. Evelyn stood motionless behind them, her dark eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. She had been acting strangely all week, Eleanor noticed. Quieter than usual, if such a thing were possible. Evelyn had always been reserved, but lately she seemed almost absent, as if part of her was somewhere else entirely. "Magnificent," Josiah murmured, though whether he was referring to the bride or the composition, no one could say. "Hold that pose just a moment longer." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4 times, its deep bronze notes echoing through the parlor. In that moment, as the sound reverberated off the walls, Eleanor could have sworn she saw something move in her peripheral vision. A shadow where no shadow should be, a reflection that didn't match reality. But when she glanced toward the mirror, there was nothing there except the ornate glass, dark and silent as a pool of still water. The camera mechanism clicked with finality. "Perfect," Josiah said, though his hands were trembling as he began to pack his equipment. "Absolutely perfect." He left Magnolia Grove within the hour, claiming urgent business in Charleston. The truth was, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in that parlor was watching him, something that didn't want to be captured on silver and glass. The wedding proceeded without incident. Eleanor and Frederick exchanged vows in the garden, surrounded by magnolias and the scent of jasmine. Evelyn served at the reception, moving through the guests like a shadow, her presence barely acknowledged by the white attendees who were too absorbed in talk of war and glory to notice a slave girl with sad eyes. It wasn't until a week later that Josiah developed the daguerreotype in his Charleston studio. What he saw in that mirror's reflection made him drop the silver plate, his hand shaking so violently he couldn't pick it up for several minutes. When he finally did, he stared at the image for a long time, trying to convince himself he was seeing things. But there was no denying what the mirror had captured, or rather what it had failed to capture. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen in the reflection. The bride and groom were there, perfectly mirrored in the antique glass. The parlor furniture, the wallpaper, even the dust motes floating in the afternoon light, all reflected with crystal clarity. But where Evelyn should have been standing, there was nothing but empty space. Josiah's first instinct was to destroy the daguerreotype. Melt it down, forget it, pretend it never existed. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was professional curiosity, or maybe something darker, a compulsion he couldn't name. Instead, he locked the daguerreotype in his safe and tried to forget about it. But forgetting proved impossible, because the very next day, Josiah received news that made his blood run cold. News that traveled through Charleston slave quarters like wildfire, whispered in kitchens and laundries and cotton fields. Evelyn had been found dead in her quarters at Magnolia Grove. Heart failure, the plantation doctor said. She had died peacefully in her sleep. The death was dated April 9th, 1861. But according to Josiah's careful notes, Evelyn had been very much alive when he photographed her on April 12th. Or had she? As Josiah stared at the daguerreotype, studying Evelyn's image with a magnifying glass, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Her eyes, clearly visible in the photograph, were completely black. Not brown, not dark brown, but black as midnight, reflecting nothing. And if he looked very carefully at the space behind the wedding party, the space where Evelyn should have been reflected in the mirror, he could see something else, something that shouldn't have been there. Chains, invisible in the real world, but clearly visible in the mirror's reflection. Chains that seemed to extend from the empty space where Evelyn should have been, disappearing into the depths of the glass like roots into dark soil. What did that mirror truly see? And why was Evelyn missing from its reflection when she appeared so solid in the photograph? The answer lies in Magnolia Grove's darkest secret, a secret that the Beaumont family would kill to protect. 3 days after the wedding, as Charleston buzzed with news of Confederate victories and federal retreats, Josiah Crane found himself unable to concentrate on anything but the daguerreotype locked in his safe. The image haunted him. Not just Evelyn's absence from the mirror, but something else he had noticed upon closer examination. In the photograph, Evelyn appeared solid, real, present. But there was something wrong with the shadows. While Eleanor and Frederick cast clear, defined shadows on the parlor floor, Evelyn cast none at all. It was as if light passed through her rather than being blocked by her form. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Josiah made the decision to return to Magnolia Grove. He told himself it was professional curiosity. Perhaps there had been some flaw in his equipment, some trick of the light that could explain the anomaly. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. The plantation looked different in the harsh afternoon sun. The Spanish moss that had seemed romantic during the wedding now appeared diseased, hanging from the oak trees like funeral shrouds. The manor house itself, with its white columns and wraparound galleries, looked tired, as if it was slowly sinking into the Carolina soil under the weight of its own secrets. Eleanor Ashworth, she had taken her husband's name, as was proper, met him at the front door. She was still beautiful, but there was something hollow about her eyes, as if the joy had been drained from them in the few days since her wedding. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice carefully modulated in the manner of Southern ladies. "How unexpected. I thought you had delivered all the photographs." "I did deliver the family portraits," Josiah replied, clutching his leather satchel. "But there's one image." "Mrs. Ashworth, I need to ask you about Evelyn." Eleanor's face went pale beneath her carefully applied powder. Evelyn passed away. Surely you heard?" "When exactly did she die?" "April 9th, Eleanor said quickly. 3 days before the wedding. It was very sudden. Heart failure, Dr. Morrison said. These things happen with her people." Josiah felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "April 9th? But that's impossible. She was in the photograph. I saw her. We all saw her." Eleanor's gloved hand gripped the doorframe so tightly the fabric stretched. "I think you're mistaken, Mr. Crane. Evelyn wasn't at the wedding. She couldn't have been." "Mrs. Ashworth, I have the daguerreotype right here." "No!" Eleanor's voice was sharp, almost panicked. "No, you're wrong. Evelyn died before the wedding. We held a small service for her in the slave quarters, but she wasn't at the ceremony. She couldn't have been there." But even as she spoke, Josiah could see the doubt creeping into her eyes, the same doubt that had been eating at him for days. "May I come in?" he asked gently. "I think we need to discuss this." Eleanor hesitated, glancing nervously toward the interior of the house. "Frederick is away with his regiment, and I don't think it would be proper. Mrs. Ashworth, this is a matter of some urgency. I believe there may be something unusual about your plantation." The word unusual seemed to break something in Eleanor's composure. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The interior of Magnolia Grove was cool and dim, but it felt oppressive rather than refreshing. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the heavy curtains, and there was an underlying smell of decay that no amount of magnolia-scented potpourri could mask. They sat in the same parlor where the photograph had been taken. The mirror still dominated one wall, its silver frame now looking more tarnished than Josiah remembered. He found himself avoiding its reflection as he spoke. "Mrs. Ashworth, I need to show you something." He withdrew the daguerreotype from his satchel with trembling hands. "This was taken on April 12th, your wedding day." Eleanor took the silver plate, and Josiah watched her face carefully. At first, She smiled, the automatic response of a bride seeing her wedding portrait, but then her expression changed. Confusion, then fear, then something approaching horror. This isn't right," she whispered. "Evelyn is in the photograph, but she's not in the mirror. How is that possible? I was hoping you could tell me." Eleanor stared at the image for a long moment, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "She looks so real," she murmured, "so solid. But if she died on April 9th... "Did she?" Josiah asked quietly. "Are you certain about that date?" Eleanor's hands began to shake, causing the daguerreotype to tremble. Yes, no, I don't know anymore. Everything about that week is confused in my memory. Mother Ashworth says she died before the wedding, but I could have sworn." She trailed off, pressing her fingers to her temples. "What do you remember?" "I remember her helping me into the dress. I remember her standing behind us during the photograph. But Mother Ashworth says that's impossible. She says I'm confused, that grief is playing tricks with my memory." Josiah leaned forward. What kind of girl was Evelyn? "Devoted," Eleanor said immediately. "She had been with my family since she was a child. Her mother worked here before her and her grandmother before that. Evelyn used to say that Magnolia Grove was in her blood, that she could never leave even if she wanted to." A chill ran down Josiah's spine. Did she ever say anything about the mirror? Eleanor's eyes snapped to the ornate glass, then quickly away. She didn't like it. Said it showed things that weren't there, or didn't show things that were. I thought she was just being superstitious. You know how they are. "Mrs. Ashworth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. On your wedding day, did you actually see Evelyn with your own eyes, or do you only remember her being there?" Eleanor was quiet for so long that Josiah began to wonder if she had heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know. I thought I saw her, but when I try to focus on the memory, it becomes unclear, like trying to remember a dream." "And your mother-in-law? What does she say?" "Mother Ashworth insists Evelyn wasn't there. She says I'm letting my imagination run away with me, that the stress of the wedding and Evelyn's death has confused my memories." Eleanor looked up at Josiah with desperate eyes. "But if she wasn't there, how do you explain the photograph?" Josiah had no answer for that. But he was beginning to suspect that the truth was far stranger and more terrifying than either of them could imagine. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'd like to speak with some of the other slaves who were here that day. Perhaps they can help clarify things." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "The others are afraid to speak about Evelyn. They whisper among themselves, but they won't talk to white folks about it. They say—" She hesitated. "What do they say?" "They say she's still here, that she never left, that sometimes, late at night, they can hear her moving through the house, tending to duties that no longer need tending." Theodore studied the daguerreotype again, focusing on Evelyn's image. She looked so real, so present, but the mirror told a different story. A story that suggested Evelyn had been dead for days when this photograph was taken. "Mrs. Ashworth, I think we need to find out exactly when Evelyn died. And more importantly, we need to find out why she might have appeared in this photograph if she was already dead." Eleanor nodded, though she looked terrified. "Where do we start?" "With Evelyn's quarters. If she lived here, there might be something that can help us understand what happened." Eleanor led him through the house to a back staircase that led to the slave quarters, a series of small rooms above the kitchen and laundry. Evelyn's room was tiny but neat, with a single window that looked out over the plantation's cotton fields. It felt empty in a way that went beyond mere absence, as if the very life had been drained from it. But it was what they found hidden beneath Evelyn's straw mattress that made everything clear and infinitely more terrifying. a small leather journal written in a careful hand that spoke of secret education and hidden literacy. The final entry was dated April 12th, 1861, the day of the wedding. The day Evelyn was supposedly already dead. They think I'm gone, but I can't leave. Not yet. Miss Eleanor needs me for her special day. I promised her Mama I would always take care of her, and I keep my promises. Even death can't break a promise made to family. The mirror knows the truth. It always has. But some truths are too terrible for white folks to bear. They see what they want to see, believe what they need to believe. But the mirror don't lie. I feel myself fading, but I won't go until Miss Eleanor is safe, until she's married and settled. Then maybe I can rest. Maybe then the chains will finally break. Eleanor sank onto the small wooden chair beside Evelyn's bed, the journal trembling in her hands. She was already dead when she wrote this. How is that possible? Josiah was studying the room more carefully now, his photographer's eye catching details that others might miss. The walls were covered with small scratches, marks that looked almost like writing, but in no alphabet he recognized. "Mrs. Ashworth, look at these marks on the walls. Do you know what they are?" Eleanor examined the scratches, her face growing paler by the moment. They're protection symbols, African symbols. The older slaves sometimes carved them to ward off evil spirits. "Or to bind good ones," Josiah said quietly. "Mrs. Ashworth, I think Evelyn found a way to stay after death, to fulfill her promise to your family." "But why doesn't she appear in the mirror?" Josiah was beginning to understand, though the truth chilled him to the bone. "Because mirrors reflect the soul, not just the body, and Evelyn's soul. I think Evelyn's soul is trapped somewhere else." The journal revealed Evelyn's final secret, but it also raised new questions. If Evelyn was dead, how had she appeared so solid in the photograph? And what did she mean about chains that needed to break? The answers lay in Magnolia Grove's darkest chapter, a chapter the Beaumont family had tried desperately to forget. The Beaumont family records were kept in the plantation office, a small building behind the main house where the business of slavery was conducted with the same meticulous attention to detail as any other commercial enterprise. Eleanor had never set foot in the office before. It was considered men's business. But now she and Josiah pored over ledgers and documents by candlelight, searching for clues about Evelyn's family history. What they found was disturbing beyond imagination. "Look at this," Josiah said, pointing to an entry in a leather-bound ledger from 1823. "Sarah, age 15, purchased from the Middleton plantation. Assigned to house duties, died 1825, 3 days before Master Thomas Beaumont's wedding to Miss Catherine Rutledge." Eleanor felt sick. 3 days before the wedding. Just like Evelyn. "It gets worse," Josiah continued, his finger tracing the faded ink. "Look at this entry from 1834. Rebecca, age 18, died of fever 3 days before Master James Beaumont's wedding." And here's another. "Grace, age 20, heart failure 3 days before Master William Beaumont's wedding to Miss Margaret Ashford." Eleanor stared at the records in horror. They all died 3 days before weddings, all of them. But it was what they found in a locked drawer. A drawer Eleanor had to break open with a letter opener that revealed the full scope of the Beaumont family's dark secret. A collection of daguerreotypes and paintings spanning nearly 50 years, all wedding portraits, all featuring the same disturbing detail. In every image, a young black woman stood behind the wedding party. And in every image, the woman cast no reflection in the mirrors that adorned the parlor walls. "Dear God," Eleanor whispered, spreading the images across the desk. "It's been happening for decades, the same pattern over and over." Josiah examined each image with his magnifying glass. "Look at their eyes," he said urgently. "In every photograph, their eyes are completely black. No reflection, no depth, just Emptiness. Eleanor picked up a painting from 1798, her hands shaking. "This is my great-great-grandmother's wedding. And there," she pointed to a figure in the background. "That must be the first one, the first girl who—" "Who what?" Josiah asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Who was bound to serve beyond death." They found the explanation in a journal hidden behind the false back of the drawer, a journal written in the careful script of Eleanor's great-great-grandfather, Thomas Beaumont, the founder of Magnolia Grove. 15th day of June, 1798. The African woman Mama Celia has taught me the old ways, the binding rituals that her grandmother brought from across the water. She says the spirits of the devoted can be called to serve even after the flesh fails, but only if the binding is done properly, with the right symbols and the right words. I have chosen Sarah for the first binding. She is young, strong, and devoted to the family. When she dies, and she will die, for the binding requires death, her spirit will remain to serve the Beaumont brides. She will ensure that our women are always cared for, always protected. The mirror will not reflect the bound spirits, for they exist between worlds, but they will appear solid to the living, able to perform their duties as if they still drew breath. It is a perfect solution to the problem of trusted servants, loyalty that transcends death itself. Eleanor dropped the journal as if it had burned her. My family has been practicing some kind of spiritual slavery for generations. Josiah was studying the binding symbols drawn in the journal's margins, complex patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. These symbols. They're carved into the walls of the slave quarters. I saw them in Evelyn's room. The protection symbols, Eleanor said, understanding dawning in her eyes. They weren't protection symbols at all. They were binding symbols, chains made of spiritual energy instead of iron. A sound from the main house made them both freeze. Footsteps on the front porch, slow and deliberate. Eleanor's mother-in-law wasn't expected back from Charleston until the following week. "Someone's in the house," Eleanor whispered. They crept back toward the manor, the journal and daguerreotypes clutched in Eleanor's hands. The front door stood open, though Eleanor was certain she had locked it. Inside, they could hear movement in the parlor, the soft whisper of fabric, the gentle clink of china. Eleanor peered around the doorframe and gasped. Evelyn stood in the parlor, arranging flowers in a crystal vase with the same careful attention to detail she had shown in life. But her movements were wrong somehow, too fluid, too graceful, as if she were floating rather than walking. "Evelyn," Eleanor called softly. The figure turned, and Eleanor saw those same black empty eyes that had haunted the daguerreotype. Evelyn's mouth moved, but no sound emerged. Instead, her voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, a whisper that filled the entire house. "Miss Eleanor, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe." "Evelyn, you're dead. You died 3 days before my wedding." "Death is just another kind of service for my people. The binding holds me here, holds us all here. We cannot rest while the symbols remain." Eleanor stepped into the parlor, her heart pounding. "What symbols? How do we break the binding?" Evelyn pointed toward the mirror, the same mirror that had refused to reflect her image. As Eleanor approached, the glass began to clear, as if an invisible hand were wiping away decades of dust and spiritual residue. What she saw in the reflection made her scream. The mirror showed the parlor as it truly was, not the elegant room she knew, but a place of suffering. The walls were covered with binding symbols, carved deep into the wood and painted with substances Eleanor didn't want to identify. And standing throughout the room, visible only in the mirror's reflection, were dozens of young black women, all wearing the same dark dress, all with the same empty black eyes. Sarah from 1825. Rebecca from 1834, Grace from 1847, and so many others, generations of women who had been bound to serve the Beaumont family even in death. The binding grows stronger with each generation, Evelyn's voice whispered from the walls. Each new spirit adds to the power, makes it harder to break. But it can be broken, Miss Eleanor. The symbols can be destroyed. Eleanor looked at the mirror, seeing the truth of her family's legacy for the first time. How? How do we destroy them? Fire, Evelyn said simply. Fire cleanses all sins, but you must burn the symbols in all the places they are hidden, the slave quarters, the parlor, the family office, and you must burn the binding journal. Only then will we be free. Josiah stepped forward, his camera equipment in his hands. Mrs. Ashworth, we have to do this. We can't let this continue. But before Eleanor could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Through the parlor windows, they could see Confederate soldiers dismounting in the front yard, their grey uniforms dusty from hard riding. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she recognized the lead rider. Frederick had returned from Virginia, and he wasn't alone. With him was his mother, Mrs. Ashworth, and a man Eleanor didn't recognize, a tall, gaunt figure in a black coat who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Eleanor!" Frederick's voice called from the front porch. "Eleanor, where are you?" Eleanor looked at Josiah, panic in her eyes. How could she explain what they had discovered? How could she tell her husband that his new family had been practicing a form of supernatural slavery for generations? "Mrs. Ashworth," Josiah whispered urgently, "we have to destroy those symbols, tonight, before they can stop us." But before Eleanor could respond, Frederick appeared in the parlor doorway, his mother and the stranger close behind. He took in the scene, his wife and the photographer standing before the mirror, the family records spread out like evidence of a crime, the daguerreotypes that revealed the family's darkest secret. His face went very pale, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and controlled. "I see you've discovered our family's tradition." Eleanor stared at her husband in shock. You knew about this, and you said nothing." "Of course I knew," Frederick said quietly. "Every Ashworth man knows when he marries into the Beaumont family. It's part of the arrangement, part of what makes this plantation so prosperous. The bound spirits ensure that our wives are always cared for, always protected. They're slaves, Frederick, even in death they're slaves." Frederick's expression didn't change. "They're servants, Eleanor. Devoted servants who have found a way to continue their service even after death. It's quite remarkable, actually." The stranger in the black coat stepped forward, and Eleanor saw that his eyes held the same cold intelligence as the binding symbols. "I am Dr. Mordecai Blackwood," he said, in a voice like rustling parchment. "I have been the keeper of the old knowledge for the Beaumont family for many years. It seems some education is required." In the mirror, the bound spirits were becoming more agitated, pressing against the glass with increasing desperation. Cracks began to appear in the silver surface, spider-webbing outward from where their hands touched. "The binding is weakening," Dr. Blackwood observed with clinical detachment. "It happens sometimes when outsiders interfere, but it can be reinforced." He moved toward a leather satchel he had brought with him, withdrawing items that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Iron shackles that glowed with an unnatural light, a branding iron covered in symbols, and a leather-bound book that seemed to absorb the candlelight around it. "Frederick, no!" Eleanor pleaded. "This is wrong. This has always been wrong." "This is tradition," Frederick replied, beginning to arrange the items in a circle around the mirror. "This is what has kept the Beaumont family prosperous for generations. The bound spirits serve us in life and in death, and in return, we provide them with purpose." Josiah stepped forward, his camera raised. "I'm going to document this. The world needs to know what you people have been doing." Dr. Blackwood looked at him with something approaching amusement. "Mr. Crane, you don't understand. You can't leave here knowing what you know. The family secret must be protected." The temperature in the room plummeted, and Eleanor realized with growing terror that Dr. Blackwood wasn't just talking about reinforcing the binding on the spirits. He was talking about adding new souls to their collection. In the mirror, Evelyn pressed her face against the glass, her black eyes fixed on Eleanor. Her mouth moved urgently, and this time Eleanor heard her voice clearly. "The fire, Miss Eleanor. You must start the fire. It's the only way to save us all." The Beaumont family's darkest secret was finally revealed, but Eleanor and Josiah were trapped in a house where the dead served the living, and where some traditions were worth killing to protect. With the binding weakening and Dr. Blackwood determined to maintain the spiritual slavery, their only hope lay in the very souls they were trying to free. The ritual circle was nearly complete. Dr. Blackwood moved with practiced efficiency, placing the glowing shackles at precise points around the mirror, while Frederick and his mother watched with the detached interest of people observing a familiar procedure. Eleanor felt sick as she realized this wasn't the first time they had witnessed the reinforcement of the binding. "The beauty of the old ways," Dr. Blackwood murmured as he worked, "is their permanence. Once properly bound, a spirit cannot escape through death, cannot find peace in the afterlife. They exist in eternal service, their devotion preserved forever." In the mirror, the trapped spirits pressed against the glass with increasing desperation. Eleanor could see them clearly now, dozens of young women spanning nearly a century, all bound to serve the Beaumont family beyond death. Their mouths moved in silent screams, their hands clawed at the silver surface, and their empty black eyes reflected nothing but despair. Josiah clutched his camera equipment, his knuckles white with tension. "This is monstrous," he whispered. "You're talking about enslaving souls." Mrs. Ashworth spoke for the first time since entering the parlor, her voice carrying the authority of generations of plantation mistresses. "Mr. Crane, you clearly don't understand the natural order of things. These girls were born to serve. Death doesn't change that fundamental truth." "They were born free," Eleanor protested, finding her voice at last. "They were stolen from their families, forced into bondage, and now you've found a way to extend that bondage into eternity." Frederick looked at his wife with something approaching pity. "Eleanor, you're being emotional. This arrangement has served both families well for generations. The spirits are content in their service. Look at them." Eleanor pointed to the mirror, where the bound spirits continued their desperate struggle against the glass. "Do they look content to you?" Dr. Blackwood paused in his preparations, following Eleanor's gaze to the mirror. "Ah, yes. They do become agitated when the binding weakens, but once it's reinforced, they'll return to their proper state of peaceful servitude." He withdrew the leather-bound book from his satchel, its pages seeming to flutter of their own accord. The symbols on the cover writhed and shifted in the candlelight, and Eleanor could feel a malevolent energy radiating from the tome. "The reinforcement ritual requires a blood sacrifice," Dr. Blackwood explained conversationally. "Traditionally, we would use one of the plantation's slaves, but given the current political situation, we'll have to make do with what's available." His cold gaze fell on Josiah, and Eleanor realized with horror what he was suggesting. "You can't," she breathed. "You can't murder an innocent man to maintain your spiritual slavery." "I can and I will," Dr. Blackwood replied calmly. "The binding must be maintained. The old ways must be preserved." Frederick drew his sword, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Mr. Crane, but you've seen too much, and your sacrifice will serve a greater purpose." In the mirror, Evelyn's spirit pressed against the glass so hard that new cracks appeared in the silver surface. Her voice echoed through the room, filled with urgency. "Miss Eleanor, the symbols. You must destroy the symbols before the ritual is complete." Eleanor looked around the parlor desperately, searching for something, anything that could help them. Her eyes fell on the oil lamp sitting on the side table, its flame dancing in the supernatural wind that had begun to swirl through the room, the binding journal, the symbols carved into the walls. Fire cleanses all sins. "Josiah, Yati," she whispered, "when I give the signal, throw your camera equipment at the mirror, break the glass. What are you planning? To end this, once and for all." Dr. Blackwood had begun to chant in a language that predated English, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to resonate in Eleanor's bones. The iron shackles began to glow brighter, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. Eleanor grabbed the oil lamp and hurled it at the wall where she could see the binding symbols carved into the wood. The glass shattered, spreading burning oil across the wallpaper and exposing the hidden marks beneath. "Now!" she shouted. Josiah hurled his camera at the mirror with all his strength. The heavy equipment struck the silver surface dead center, and the already weakened glass exploded in a shower of glittering fragments. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The bound spirits poured out of the shattered mirror like water through a broken dam, their forms becoming more solid and visible with each passing second. No longer confined to the reflection, they filled the parlor with their presence, their empty black eyes now blazing with fury and long-suppressed rage. "Impossible!" Dr. Blackwood snarled, his ritual interrupted. "The binding should hold them!" But Eleanor was already moving, grabbing the binding journal from where Frederick had dropped it and thrusting it into the spreading flames. The book caught fire immediately, its pages curling and blackening as the symbols within were consumed. The effect on the spirits was instantaneous. As each page burned, their eyes began to change, the empty blackness filling with light and life and humanity. They were no longer bound slaves but free souls, and their fury was terrible to behold. Sarah, the first bound spirit from 1825, stepped forward, her form now solid and real. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of nearly 40 years of enforced servitude. "You stole our lives. You stole our deaths. You stole our very souls. But no more." Dr. Blackwood raised his hands, trying to cast some kind of protective spell, but the spirits were beyond his control now. They surrounded him, their touch draining the color from his face and the warmth from his body. "The binding is broken," Evelyn said, her voice clear and strong for the first time since her death. "We are free, and you will pay for what you've done." Frederick swung his sword at the nearest spirit, but the blade passed harmlessly through her form. "Mother, we have to get out of here!" But Mrs. Ashworth stood frozen, staring at the spirits with a mixture of terror and fascination. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "They're just slaves. They can't." "We were never just slaves," Rebecca said, her form shimmering with otherworldly light. "We were daughters, sisters, mothers. We had names, dreams, hopes, and you took all of that from us." The spirits began to move through the house, their touch igniting the binding symbols wherever they found them. The carved marks in the walls burst into flame. The hidden sigils in the floorboards glowed and cracked, and the very foundations of Magnolia Grove began to shake as decades of spiritual bondage was finally broken. Eleanor grabbed Josiah's hand and pulled him toward the door. "We have to get out. The whole house is going to burn." They ran through the corridors as the manor erupted in supernatural fire around them. Behind them, they could hear Dr. Blackwood screaming as the spirits exacted their revenge, and Frederick calling desperately for his mother. They burst out of the front door just as the roof began to collapse. The fire spread with impossible speed, consuming not just the physical structure, but something deeper, the very essence of the plantation's evil. The flames burned with colors that shouldn't exist, and the smoke carried away the screams of the guilty and the songs of the liberated. Eleanor and Josiah stood in the front yard, watching as Magnolia Grove burned to the ground. In the flames they could see the spirits dancing, their forms growing brighter and more beautiful as the last of the binding symbols were destroyed. Evelyn appeared beside them one final time, her form now radiant with freedom. "Thank you, Miss Eleanor. You gave us what we could never take for ourselves, the chance to choose our own fate." "What will happen to you now?" Eleanor asked, tears streaming down her face. "We'll go where we should have gone long ago," Evelyn replied with a smile that held no trace of the empty-eyed slave she had been forced to become. "We'll find our families, our ancestors, our peace. We'll be free." One by one, the spirits began to fade, not into darkness but into light, brilliant, warm light that seemed to heal something broken in the very air around them. As they disappeared, their voices joined in a song that Eleanor had heard drifting from the slave quarters on summer evenings, a song of hope and freedom and going home. When the last spirit had faded and the last flame had died, Eleanor and Josiah stood alone in the ruins of what had once been one of South Carolina's grandest plantations. The war would continue, the nation would tear itself apart and rebuild, but the particular evil that had festered at Magnolia Grove was finally ended. "What will you do now?" Josiah asked, as the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky. Eleanor looked at the ashes of her former life, then at the road that led away from the plantation toward an uncertain but free future. "I'll go north," she said. "I'll find a way to help end this war, to make sure that what happened here can never happen again." She paused, looking back at the ruins one last time. "And I'll tell their story, all of their stories. The world needs to know what slavery really costs, not just in this life, but in the next." As they walked away from the smouldering remains of Magnolia Grove, neither Eleanor nor Josiah noticed the figure watching them from the edge of the cotton fields, a tall man in a black coat, his face burned and twisted with rage, his eyes glowing with the same malevolent light as the binding symbols. Dr. Blackwood had survived the spirit's revenge, though he was changed by it. And as he watched Eleanor and Josiah disappear down the road toward Charleston, he began to plan his own revenge. The binding at Magnolia Grove was broken, but there were other plantations, other families, other opportunities to practice the old ways. The war might end slavery in the flesh, but Dr. Blackwood knew secrets that could ensure it continued in the spirit. The battle for the souls of the South was far from over. Modern day, the Charleston Historical Society. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian specializing in antebellum photography, carefully examined the daguerreotype that had been donated to the Society's collection. The image was remarkable, one of the finest examples of 1860s portrait photography she had ever seen, but it was the accompanying documentation that made her hands tremble as she read. Josiah Crane's detailed account of the events at Magnolia Grove, written in his own hand and authenticated by multiple experts. Eleanor Ashworth's testimony, given to Union authorities in 1863. Newspaper accounts of the mysterious fire that had destroyed one of South Carolina's most prominent plantations. And most disturbing of all, the modern forensic analysis of the daguerreotype itself. Digital enhancement had revealed what the naked eye couldn't see. The figure of Evelyn standing behind the wedding party cast no shadow, reflected no light, and appeared to be slightly translucent when examined under high magnification. But it was the mirror in the background that provided the most chilling evidence. Enhanced imaging showed that while the bride and groom were clearly reflected in the antique glass, the space where Evelyn stood showed something else entirely. Chains, barely visible but unmistakably present, extending from the empty space into the depths of the mirror itself. Dr. Mitchell had spent her career studying the intersection of photography and the supernatural, documenting cases where cameras had captured things that shouldn't exist. But this was different. This was proof of something far more sinister than a simple ghost story. This was evidence of spiritual slavery, the binding of souls beyond death. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for the Smithsonian's Department of Paranormal Research. This discovery was too important to keep to herself. As she waited for the call to connect, Dr. Mitchell didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows behind her, a tall man in an old-fashioned black coat, his face bearing the scars of supernatural fire, his eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. Dr. Mordecai Blackwood had been waiting a very long time for someone to rediscover the truth about Magnolia Grove. And now that they had, he could finally begin his work again. The old ways were not dead. They had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. Thank you for joining us for this chilling journey into the dark heart of the antebellum South. If this story sent shivers down your spine, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We have many more tales of supernatural horror waiting to be told. What did you think of Eleanor's choice to burn down her own family's legacy? Would you have had the courage to free the bound spirits, knowing it would cost you everything? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that wear human faces and call their evil tradition. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.